All right, can you hear me, everyone? Good morning. All right. So, yes, I'll be talking about MicroXML this morning, and a bit about myself, although I'm not going to go through all that. Let's just suffice to say I go back. Not way back like what I call the SGML Illuminati, you know. Yeah, I was planting trees in the Grove model back in 1982. Not that far back, but as far as the XML era goes, quite a ways. So, let's say, as I'll point out, it takes a little bit to drive you towards what we did in MicroXML. So first of all, just take a look at what we're going to be talking about today. First of all, a little bit about the history, because, you know, Santayana, I believe, said. And then I'll take a quick tour of it, and then we'll talk a little bit about, I guess, the implications and what that means. So, speaking about history, as Mohammed said, you know, XML 15 years old today. So, and they'd mentioned that there was a surprise, and I hope I'm not about to preempt their surprise, because I know nothing about what the surprise of the organizers are. But you guys look like you need to wake up. It's Sunday morning. It's XML's birthday. You're at an XML conference. Let's sing. Come on. Happy birthday, XML. 1, 2, 3. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday, dear XML. I think I broke the mic. Happy birthday to you. All right. XML, woohoo! All right. XML was born, and everyone was immediately trying to kill it. It didn't take long at all, did it? So, and you know, that's the whole problem. Throughout the history of XML, people have been saying, okay, look, this thing is just too complicated. What can we do about it? So one of my favorite guys, Paul T, who was obsessive about finding a way to kill XML immediately. He created a page. I just have like a little sliver of about 10 pages long of every obsessive potential alternative to XML he could think of. And, you know, put it up there. And of course, you know, one of them was JSON. But the page, unfortunately, is down now. He stopped maintaining it. He just kind of gave up. This thing is not going to die. As Liam would say if you were here, once the technology is in your sneakers, it's in there forever. It's there on the Wayback Machine, which I resurrected just for you. Just a small sampling, you know. Of course, you might recognize some of these. Well, actually, you probably recognize like 1 or 2 of these. Limno probably would be the one most recognized here at the conference. But yeah, everyone has tried to take a swipe. So to take a closer look at one of them, which I think in the context of MicroXML is particularly interesting, SML, or Common XML. SML, Simplified Markup Language, is actually a mailing list, SML Dev, which sprang out of XML Dev, you know, way back in like 1999, you know, again, not very long after XML's birth. In it, Don Park was trying to, in effect, come up with an alternative to XML. And the group eventually came up with something that was called Common XML. And the idea was to start with canonical XML and see what one could fix about XML. And you know, the initial discussion was, okay, attributes have to go, processing instructions, DTDs, you know, non-character entity references, C data sections, nonsense of other encodings besides UTF-8, and no optional features of any sort. That was the initial discussion. So attributes made it back. By the time, you know, sort of the SML group arrived at attributes, at Common XML, attributes made it back into the spec. And, you know, thank goodness for that, because, of course, they never tried to axe mixed content, which, believe it or not, a lot of people have said mixed content is what needs to go in XML. But at least no one was thinking about that back in 1999. They were just thinking about attributes, and that survived. And I think that makes a lot of sense, because it's worth thinking, what is it that makes XML XML? What's the magic? What's at the heart of this thing? You know, is it all the, you know, is it DTDs and entities and the inheritance from SGML? Is it the shape of the brackets? You know, is it, what is it that makes XML? And I certainly have an opinion of my own, which is you need attributes because that's basically your metadata. That's where you put in the stuff that's not really coming from the original creative minds of the folks who are putting together the information content. It's stuff that's coming from those who want to make sure that that original creative content is well maintained and well managed and well processed. So it's the out-of-line metadata, or rather I should say the inline metadata. You need mixed content because if you don't, you basically are back to tables. A lot of people try to shoehorn data into the square shape, relational databases, spreadsheets, whatever. And the point is that a lot of the most valuable information in humanity is not square. It's ragged, it's semi-structured. And that's why you need mixed content. In my opinion, without mixed content, XML is useless. And then finally, Unicode, which is just basically the desperate hacker approach to having lived through the character wars of various sorts. Nobody wants to live through that again. Unicode is far from perfect, but it's better than trying to rehash the alternatives. Just stick to what's kind of out there and what's working on the web. So that's all well and good to talk about, but for the longest time, obviously, it was just talk. Who really cared whether it was whether XML was needed to be simplified or anything else like that. It was all big endian versus little endian. And then something interesting happened. Everything has its time. And in 2010, Twitter and Foursquare dropped XML from their APIs. They said, okay, no more XML, just JSON only. We've had enough of this nonsense. So somebody sitting next to you or nearby you said, that's what I think about it. First reaction, who cares, right? And that's fair enough, because people have always said, hey, JSON's going to take, steal XML's lunch. And for those of us here, we probably all agree, that's fine. If you want to go to JSON, go to JSON. We don't care. James Clark, however, did say, yeah, I agree on the meh, but maybe it's time for the XML community to take a look at themselves a little bit here, right? There's a gulf between us and them. The huge hordes of the them out there who are building, frankly, all the cool stuff. There's an enormous gulf between us here. Basically the web developers out there are terrified or just dislike XML. I have one foot in the XML community, another foot in my favorite programming language, Python community. And I can tell you, Python programmers absolutely detest XML. All they want to do is parse it, get it out of that nonsense angle brackets as quickly as they can into their nice data structures, and they're good to go. So we have a problem. I mean, we can feel superior. Oh yeah, you guys just don't know what you're talking about. But it's kind of a little bit of a problem when all the cool stuff, you guys saw the presentations yesterday. Most of the presentations were all about how can we get some of all that cool stuff that's going out on the web, whether it's schema.org or whether it's, neat Java, browser applications, whether it's Twitter. How can we get a piece of that? That's the problem. So James was basically, I think, making the very important point that XML has just become too complicated, too enterprisey. No one understands it. It doesn't bring any value relative to the load that it puts on people's backs. So generally, as people in this community know, when James Clark talks, people listen. And that basically led to a mad scramble of activity in December 10. I mean, it's one of the longest sets of conversations since some of the great debates in the XML community, such as the famous hash versus slash URI or the what namespace URI resolution. December 2010, everyone was talking about the future of XML and, do we need XML 2.0 or anything else like that? James Clark came along and just crystallized it and said, listen, here's my proposal. It's something called MicroXML. It's a radical simplification of it. And he put it up in a blog post, and there are a couple of URLs there for the information. So throughout 2011, it kind of cooled down while everybody reflected upon it. And John Cohen drafted a spec, to go with sort of the BNF that James Clark had come up with. And he posted it with his own variations on the grammar. And then he also implemented it. I mean, that's where, code talks, right? So he implemented it. I'll talk very slightly about his implementation later. And then in 2012, last year, the media sort of caught up to it. I wrote an article on IBM Developer Works. I was, of course, a large part of the conversations on XML Dev and on the weblogs, et cetera. And then Software Development Times picked that up, and it kind of crystallized everyone to say, hey, okay, maybe there's something here. There's a lot of, no smoke without fire, et cetera. So a W3C Community Group was set up in order to try to, pull something together around MicroXML. So it went semi-official, as I say. It doesn't really have any sort of standards, official standing. It's just a community group, but it's a community group of I think, hopefully people who can sort of make a bit of a difference. So anyway, so transitioning a little bit from the history to a look at MicroXML, and this is not going to take long, and that's the whole point. That's the beauty of it. I know many conferences we've been to, it's like full day, tutorial on XML, and I'm like, that's where you lost all your developers. So interestingly enough, what we came up with MicroXML looks, not very dissimilar to the whole old common XML thing back in 1999. Instead of, we do of course have attributes, like I said, that's essential. But draconian error handling is gone. So it basically means that the parser is not required to stop when it encounters a fatal error. It must report the fact that this is non-well-formed MicroXML, but it can continue, and what it does, depends. There are no DTD features or XML, no DTD features or XML declaration, so all that's gone. It's very simple. No colons in XML attribute names. That means no namespaces, so hold on to your seats. Only hexadecimal character entity references are allowed, no decimal character entity references. No processing instructions or C data sections, so again, a lot of that stuff that no one really understood properly. And then, only UTF-8, so none of the exotic sort of how you declare character encodings, and you can use almost anything under the sun. And then a few small tweaks to the character encoding model, no naked greater thans and attribute content, for example. Just some minor additional restrictions which make it easier, generally make it easier to parse and process. So that, that's pretty much it. It's very simple. I mean, basically what we've done is we've reduced it back to the heart of XML, which is, elements, attributes, and content. That's the heart of it. And MicroXML, we've basically gone back to the heart of it all. So, so of course, one of the things you might be thinking is, whoa, okay, you mean you can have ill-formed XML? Well, what does that mean? And, the point is, well, sure, that's a little bit scary, but the world deals with that all the time. First of all, how many people deal with well-formed XML reliably at the outside end of their processing tool chain? Very few of us do. We just kind of hope, and then we tidy it up if it doesn't come in okay, which is most of the time. So MicroXML is just basically trying to do away with the vanity that we're going to just, wield the big judge's gavel, and everyone's all of a sudden going to be well-formed. So the MicroXML parser has to say, this is not well-formed, because that's important to flag that. But then there are a lot of things that you can do afterwards. You can stop. You can just continue, and so that you can get all the errors. A lot of XML parsers out there will give you the first error and die. And that is such a frustration for a developer. libxml at least would go through and give you, subsequent errors, which is very handy. And people were even frowning on that, although I think, technically speaking, the spec gave them leeway to do that. A lot of things in the XML spec are vague, and that's one of the things about its length. But basically, it's just little things like tell me all the errors in this document so that I don't have to go through them one by one and die every time. And another thing is error recovery. HTML5, of course, made this whole thing about this extremely complicated way of recovering from HTML errors and how to interpret things. And MicroXML is not saying you have to do that, because that would be ghastly probably, but what it's saying is that, hey, if somebody wants to take that up, we're not going to stand in their way. We're just saying, tell us whether or not it's well-formed MicroXML, leave it at that. So, Okay, and then the fun part. So, no namespaces, and this probably took up more of the conversation, more of the discussion than any other topic that was covered. Basically, people were saying, what are we going to do about all the stuff that's out there that already uses namespaces? Are we going to adapt into it? Are we going to, are we going to at least be forward compatible to future use of namespaces? How about all the XML stuff? How about XML ID? How about XML : space? How about all of those things, even the ones that were originally in the XML spec? What do? Are they all gone? And there was just a lot of discussion, but in the end, and the alternatives were to say, okay, we're going to allow just what was called SINE namespaces, which are namespaces where you declare them all at the top, and you declare all the namespaces at the top, and you just use those are the prefixes you use throughout the document. Joe English, back in the XML dev days, came up with sort of a DSM-4, like a mental health classification of XML, which is very funny. Whether it's borderline because you redefine XML namespaces within the document, or whether it's psychotic because you use different prefixes for different URLs within the document. But he came up with a definition of sanity, which was that you just declare everything at the top, and then you just stick to those prefixes. And another approach to sanity is that you just use the default namespace. You declare one namespace at the top of the document, and that's the only thing you use. So these were all things that we discussed, different possible approaches to it. In the end, after a lot of debate, we kind of agreed that, let's just, in effect, start at the beginning. Kill them. Just, death to namespaces. We'll figure out how to deal with the things that people think that they need namespaces for. And so there are no colons in any MicroXML name. The XMLNS name itself is illegal. You can't use that. So you can't even grandfather in or pretend on XML namespaces. They're completely gone. So you might be thinking, wow, that's crazy. XML is all about namespaces. Well, of course it's not. Namespaces predated, XML of course predated namespaces. I've actually had to tell people this. The sort of backroom story of XML namespaces the way they are now is basically all about RDF, which John Snelson was talking about last night. The RDF people said, we need a way to encode these URLs within the XML so that you can, in effect, not have to repeat these long URL strings all over the place. And then, after a lot of discussion with the XML people, the compromise came about in the form of what's currently XML namespaces. But it was never something that was inevitable or something that you couldn't avoid. It was never that way. It just feels that way now because everyone happened to pile on top of namespaces. But nobody understands them. Nobody. I mean, I've written a lot of articles, I've done tutorials, I've tried to talk to developers, I've tried to talk to customers in my business. No one understands namespaces. No one gets them right. They're the most complicated thing that XML has ever produced. And there's really a lot of, sort of whistling past the grave on it. They triple everyone's code. I don't even say double, they triple everyone's code. Having implemented XML technologies many times over, I've implemented, XML parsers, DOM, SACS, XSLT. I've implemented all these things many times over, XPath, etc. And always, 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 most of the code goes to getting namespaces right. And it's the same thing, it wouldn't be so bad if it were the people implementing the tools who had to deal with that. The problem is, it's also down to the people who are using the tools. They're also wrestling with namespaces. Getting namespaces right is the most of their code, and if they're not spending 2/3 of their code getting namespaces right, you can bet that they are getting namespaces wrong. So, and then I like to throw in this little wry aside, the Treaty of Wulai, because as I said before, the biggest flame wars in the XML community are always about namespaces and namespace URIs, always, without fail. And one of the enormous ones, I believe it was back in 2003, after it, the question was, what does a namespace URI mean? Is it just a string? Is it a URL? If it's a URL or a URI, if you resolve it, what do you get? And there was the debate was angels dancing on a head of a pin. So Rick Jelliff happened to be at the hot springs in Wulai, somewhere in China. And he proposed a treaty which basically boils down to don't ask, don't tell. Which is if you're cooking up a namespace URI, expect people to look it up. Expect people to actually go to that page. And if you're looking at a URL for a namespace, don't expect to find anything when you go look it up. That was the treaty, right? Just no expectations from anybody. Well, that's pretty good. It stops the flame war, but it doesn't stop the fact that the architecture is basically broken as designed. No one can understand it, and if no one can really understand it or use it properly, that's to me a broken architecture. So we discuss, okay, well, this is going to cause rebellion, right? People are not going to give up their namespaces. I guess that's not something for the MicroXML people to do, but I'm hoping to coax, as I put it, that poison from your hands. It's one of the first, I think the canaries in the coal mine were the Xlink folks, who tried very hard, the XHTML folks. They tried very hard to implement Xlink, which was, in effect, an approach to linking in XML. It was supposed to be the core approach to linking in XML, and what it was going to do was create an embedded linking vocabulary in the form of XML namespaces, which are global attributes. You could put them on any element, and then that would tell things higher up in the processing stack, treat these as links. XHTML was the guinea pig. They ran away screaming. I mean, there were other problems in Xlink. There was also the problem that it sort of conflated, sort of the semantic information about linking with, the actuation, whether they should open up a new window or it should replace the contents of the window. There were other problems, but really it was just too much cognitive load. And they said if HTML people have just been doing ahref equals for the longest time, you're not going to get them to do ahref equals xlink xlink colon href equals, and then a whole bunch of other xlink prefixes, then a whole bunch of namespace URIs that they had to declare at the top of it. It's just not going to happen. Even if you hide all that in the DTD, you're just losing the whole plot. And so HLink came along that said, let's instead just put it in the schema where you can put a link. And that caused a huge rebellion and a flame war within XML. But it's an example of, basically how do you deal with that layering problem? So I definitely advocate that people use out-of-band annotations, whether in the schema, like the HLink people, and say, this is how I'm embedding one vocabulary into the other. It doesn't have to be stuck in the XML using this crazy colonified notation. And again, I'm going to go back to the SGML Illuminati days. Back in high time, there was the idea of the architectural forms, which were basically a set of very simple transforms that you could apply to XML vocabularies to slightly color the interpretation of different sections of that vocabulary. And it would, in effect, it gave you what namespaces gave you. Because if you have a chunk of HTML and you have an SVG block, all you're saying, for the most part, is that starting from this SVG colon SVG element, just treat it as SVG until you reach the matching SVG colon and SVG element. That's really all you're doing. So it was basically a simple way to give you that same ability through transforms. And that's what we in the MicroXML community, in effect, would advocate. And microarchitectural forms is actually one of the things that we're discussing, having sort of created a community draft for MicroXML. And the bottom line is, everyone loved the XProc stuff yesterday. We've all bought into XProc. That's excellent. Can we now take the opportunity to use those processing pipelines to improve the architecture? Let's go back to the Unix days. Pipes all the way down. Start with your 3 vocabularies, join them together in the pipes at the time you need them. I was looking at, watching the XML, the XML diff and the delta presentation yesterday, and I love the vocabulary that the XML delta, and the diff and the revision history stuff came up with. I love the vocabulary that they came up with. It's really well thought out and really well designed. But I'll be honest, I absolutely cringed at the idea of packing that stuff into the original source XML. To me, it's overloading things. And when we have these beautiful processing pipelines, why can't we keep those separate? We also have packaging, XML packaging, which things such as, ODF and everything else like that. use. We can keep these things separate. We can merge them together at the point of usage, and then we can separate them back where it makes sense again, so we're not overcomplicating. Can you imagine if every random XML format out there could suddenly be overburdened by this or overlaid by this vocabulary of XML diff and revision control, and then another vocabulary for linking, and then another vocabulary for IDs, and then another vocabulary, the list goes on and on and on. And that's the problem, the layering, and let's unravel that. Let's use XSLT. It's a powerful tool for the transforms that we need. So if you're not convinced by all that, then I think we just say, well, all right, too bad, all right? I think the namespaces, you can always replace namespaces by well-designed transformation in the processing chain. It might sound tricky, but it's less tricky than XML and the XML namespaces. I guarantee it. So we took them out of MicroXML, and think of it as an intervention from your loved ones, a very painful one, to kill that bad habit of yours that you insist that you need, and you're just holding on to for dear life. Just it's an intervention. You'll thank us later. So, all right, so moving on a little bit to some recent activity in the MicroXML world. We created the first community draft in October 2012, so not too long ago. Already there have been several implementations. It's really easy to implement. I mean, well, certainly compared. Basically, if you've been able to deal with XML, dealing with MicroXML is a doddle. Believe me, it's a lot easier. So, and there have been a lot of follow-up discussions. We got at MicroXML, now what? Error recovery, whether it's schema languages, micro-transformation languages. How simple could XSLT be if we didn't have to deal with namespaces, right? Well, I think we're about to find out. And micro-architectural forms. I was talking about architectural forms are basically a way to, move things around slightly in an XML document in order to give people flexibility in how they express it and how they interpret it. And I do want to give a little bit of extra love to the MicroLark Parser, which was the first implementation of MicroXML, originally by John Cohen, even before MicroXML was fully enshrined. It's a Java implementation, and it's based on Lark, which was one of the early implementations of XML itself by Tim Bray. Lark was also in Java, but John Cohen likes to point out that basically it's a third the size as Lark, and it adds an additional processing mode. So Lark, I'm pretty sure, had the classic pull API, which is like DOM, and the classic, like Sax, and the classic tree API, which is like DOM. John actually added in another one, which is a push API, which is kind of like the, coroutines approach to it, where you actually, sort of get events into your flow of code instead of having to write callbacks. And that makes it about, and he was able to add that and still keep it about the third the size of Lark. So the point is, it's so much easier to implement than XML itself. And there are other implementations out there. MicroXML JS, James Clark implemented that in JavaScript. If you go to the page for MicroXML JS, there's also a Java directory with a bunch of code. So I think that there's a Java version in incubation by James Clark, but he hasn't announced it. He's just announced the JavaScript version. But the JavaScript version is web browser friendly. James Fuller, one of the your organizers for this conference, used the Rex parser generation language to create MicroXML-parsers. And with MicroXML-parsers, you get C++, you get XQuery, you get JavaScript, you get a Java implementation. And I've been working on, unfortunately, just not enough time to do it, but I've been working on a simple MicroXML parser for Python, which in effect, it's just a matter of using standard parser lexer like lex and yak type of stuff. Again, it's really simple. I mean, I've got like one code module with about 150 lines of code. Most of that is dealing with the various Unicode sequences which are allowed for at least reasonable compatibility with XML. But again, unfortunately, I haven't had it's not a lot of code, but I don't even have a lot of time to maintain a little bit of code, so hopefully very soon. So a little bit about, who's MicroXML for? And Eric Vandervlist asked me yesterday, well, whom do you think it's for? Which I think is a really good question. Is it for the JSON folks? Is the idea to stop the avalanche, the eventual rise of JSON? No, heck no. It's not at all. First of all, they're going to do what they're going to do, and that's fine. And I just sit over here laughing like crazy when I see JSON people talking about, oh, we need a schema language now. Don't we need namespaces? And I'm like, you guys are going to be right back in the soup very soon. So no, I don't think it's all about converting JSON people or stopping the juggernaut of JSON or anything else like that. So, is it for people who like XML? Well, maybe. I think some people who use XML will just feel the relief of something like MicroXML, so once it's available in their tool chain. And some people just never will. If the full panoply of XML is what you want, then that's what you want, and that's that. So the way I like to characterize it is just for those who don't care anymore. I don't want to argue about what a namespace URI means. I mean, personally, for myself, my name is Uche Ogbuji, and I'm an addict. I've been sober since 2010. I do not want to argue about what a namespace URI means anymore. I do not want to try to figure out where they put the double dash in a comment that broke my whole code tool chain. I do not want to have to interpret what it means when I've had a Unicode sequence that works in one parser and does not work in another parser. I've had it. I'm done. XML is just too complicated. I love XML. Elements, attributes, content. That's what I want. So if you've reached that point, then I think MicroXML might be for you. So I bet a lot of you guys are either there or you're close. I think there are probably a lot of you who are already thinking, look, I'm sick of this, and there's some people who are new, deer in the headlights. Wow, okay, XML is a lot more complicated than I thought. So, I guess my message is, try it, because it won't take very long to try. That's kind of the point. Implement it. It won't even take you very long to implement, even if you were to start from scratch and just create your own MicroXML tools. The spec is, I believe it's about 4 or 5 pages. No, sorry, around 8 pages, depending on how you print it. But most of that is like, what's MicroXML all about? And then what are the relationships to JSON? The spec is written in a way that, the data model is expressed as JSON. Oh, I forgot to mention that. MicroXML, the spec, is not just the syntax, it's also a data model. Think the XML InfoSet. Think the XPath data model. Think, XDM. It's got all that bundled in there into that 8 or 9 pages. So it's all sort of self-contained in terms of how you interpret it as well, with that data model being expressed in JSON. So if you wanted a quick, conduit between MicroXML and JSON, you could just take the non-normative expression, which is put into the spec. But anyway, it's a small spec. Read it. That won't take very long. And again, that's the whole point of MicroXML. You can decide very quickly whether it's for you or whether it's not. So, the message is join the rebellion. Really. I mean, it's not a big deal. I haven't shown a lot of angle brackets here because there's no need. Everyone here knows complicated XML. MicroXML is the same thing with a whole bunch of the complication taken out. So there's really not a lot new. It's just a lot easier. You breathe easier, you'll know you're on the right side of the force, and you'll win when they blow up the Death Star at the end. So, join the rebellion. You'll thank us later.
Great talk. Yes? Do we have any questions for Uche? Yes.
No questions.
Thanks very much, Uche. I thought that was very interesting presentation. I think the history is particularly interesting, isn't it? And you didn't go back a lot to SGML, but of course SGML was enormously complicated in comparison with XML. And when XML came along, everybody thought, wow, that's great. That's much simpler and I can understand it. Since then, I think XML has got more complicated with namespaces and things. So my question to you is, how much of the problem is due to stuff that we've put on top of the original XML In other words, if we went back to what XML originally was, would that solve some of the problems at least?
I think that's a really good question, which is the problem the stuff we problem, XML, like namespaces, like schema, like, data typing and all that stuff. For the longest time, that's what I believed. For sort of, what I call the XPath 2.0 wars, which, I'm still a member of the resistance on that. But in all that stuff, I thought it was like, quit piling this, sort of strong typed programming, bondage and discipline approach to everything on top of it. You don't have to model everything all the way down. Lightweight agreements will do the trick. XML 1.0 gave you everything you needed for that. And I think there's an argument to be made for that. But then again, you think about the fact that there's so few good XML 1.0 implementations. And that can't be the case if we want this thing to really be widespread in the web. Everyone wants to be able to implement it themselves, and they want to be able to do it in a day. So I think XML 1.0, the spec itself is very admirable, but even that was too hard to implement, too hard to understand. We've all explained people on finer, sort of philosophical parts of XML 1.0, and it's a nightmare. We shouldn't be putting developers through even that level of cognitive load. So the MicroXML folks, we thought, let's actually take it back even a notch so that we get what we believe are the essential benefits of XML 1.0 and maybe even the essential benefits of SGML, but in a package that anyone can implement very simple. So we decided to take it all the way back, but I agree with you that if you're just to go with XML 1.0, that in itself is a huge improvement.
We have time for more questions.
Okay, MicroXML looks very much like XML 1.0. How do you decide when you read a file that it's MicroXML? It might, if you have a MicroXML parser, and then you get some weird namespaces or so, what to do then in the practice?
Yeah, and that's a good question. If it looks so much like XML, 1.0, how can you tell? And I think that's part of the idea behind, first of all, the non-draconian error handling, because basically what you could do is you can basically, the idea of MicroXML is we're not going to try to be an adult for you. So one of the things you can do is run it through a MicroXML parser, and depending on the one you pick, it might do error recovery for you. It might just say, this is not MicroXML, try your next tool in the tool chain. The other thing, what I personally have been doing with my little my little implementation so far is run it through an XML parser, which in effect turns well-formed XML into MicroXML. It's about, well, in Python, it's about 50 lines of Python code. You use the XPath parser, and then all you do is on the output side, you just put out the elements, attributes, and content, simple rules about the character encoding, etc. And you have MicroXML, you can start that in your tool chain. So it's up to you is the question. But we haven't tried to solve that very important question of how do you know whether it's MicroXML or XML. We've left that. No.
Hello. Can you hear me? Yeah.
Yes.
Just a simple question. I guess I appreciate that in certain situations namespaces are the bane of existence. In other situations, they actually are quite useful. I just wonder why not the strategy of maybe focusing on a set of conventions around in certain situations just strip namespaces out. I mean, I find myself doing that in certain situations where it's like, look, I want to make sure I don't have them, I want to get rid of them, and they're gone, and that's just part of the processing pipeline, as opposed to in other situations where I actually really need them, hey, let them be there. So I'm just curious then, why not a process approach? Why like a complete ban of the notion?
Okay, and that's a good question. Why completely ban namespaces instead of just sort of a live and let live approach where maybe you can make it easy to take them out when you don't need them? I think that's what MicroXML actually does. MicroXML is designed to live in the greater XML ecosystem. So I think the idea is that if I'm dealing with areas where I want simplicity, I just want to cut it down. I want to deal with fewest codes, fewest modalities of failure, et cetera, and everything else like that. I'd like to switch to MicroXML then, which is the same thing as you're saying, just strip out namespaces. There's no reason why you couldn't then, if you really, really, really believe you need namespaces, and let's be honest, even as MicroXML people, we're going to be getting a lot of and interacting a lot with technologies that use namespaces. The processing pipeline should make it very simple to say, at this point, this is a MicroXML stage. We're not going to deal with namespaces there. At other points, there are. And, again, we're not trying to be adults for people. But the bottom line is that namespaces are the most of the implementation, so we in the MicroXML space don't want to deal with them. They're most of what you have to teach people. So we want to say, if you don't want to have to deal with namespaces, just leave them alone. You don't even have to think about them. We're not going to, if we said they were optional, you still have to learn about them. So if you want to live just in the MicroXML space, and like I said, it's convert XML to MicroXML at the outside of the tool chain, then life is a lot easier for you. So, that was just more of a philosophical choice, I think, than anything else.
So thanks for the great presentation, and I just thought I should say that I think you don't need namespaces.
Hey, we have somebody else, all right. Is there anybody else who's got, I'm sorry, just kidding.
Because I think you can model them also. If you really want a format, you can model it.
Actually, can you elaborate on that? I mean, I think I know what you mean, but so it's not just me saying it.
You don't need a prefix if you can just add a superstructure. So, and if you have a superstructure that you map to a URI, for example, then, well, you have it.
Well, if there's time, just a very simple example, I think, is a great example is HTML. HTML is kind of the poster child for XHTML, excuse me. It's sort of the poster child for namespaces, right? Because XHTML is broadly well adopted, right? And people did things like MathXML. They did things like SVG. They did things like, Ruby and everything else like that, which used namespaces within it. Now, if you kind of unpack everything that's there, the mythical, magical need for namespaces kind of goes away, even in that core use case. SVG, well, great. You have an SVG element. Why do you need a namespace to say this is an SVG element? It says SVG. It says right on the tin, right? If you're talking about, there are other, things that are maybe a bit more implicit, but for the most part, there's always, like you said, a modeling. There's always a modeling solution. So to me, namespaces are architecture astronautics. Somewhere in the mythical future, we are going to deal with a situation where we need to combine vocabulary and we don't have a clean separation between those vocabularies. So let's design this super complicated framework to make that possible. When 90%, not even the 80-20, but 90% of the times when we're using namespaces, it's a well-defined vocabulary in a well-defined island, well-defined delimited, inside a well-defined model. We can model that away. It's not that hard.
Very short, yes. Did you consider getting rid of white space?
My only response to that is that I tried to learn the white space programming language the other day. And for that reason, I'm glad we're not that crazy. There are a couple of crazy programming languages out there. Everyone look up white space if you want your brain blown. So.